63 years ago, a German soldier woke every night screaming. It wasn't a war nightmare. It wasn't the bombs. It wasn't the gunfire. It was a song a man sang moments before he died. And that song shattered something inside him, something that never healed. Hans Müller was 22 when it happened. He was a guard at Auschwitz, his heart trained to feel nothing, his eyes trained to see no humanity. But in that cell, something different was happening. Have you ever witnessed something you shouldn't have? Something so pure, so impossible, that changed who you were forever? What Hans saw in cell 16 still echoes through the world. Because some stories haunt us and some stories liberate us. This one is both. August of 1941. The sun beat down on the grey concrete blocks. Auschwitz functioned as a precise killing machine, efficient, soulless. Hans walked the corridors with the same mechanical gait, impeccable uniform, rigid posture, a mind devoid of questioning. That's how he survived. But that day, a prisoner escaped. The rule was simple and brutal. 1 escapes, 10 die, selected at random, to deter anyone from trying. Hans watched the selection in the courtyard, 10 men in a line, awaiting death for something they didn't do. One of them began to weep. He spoke of his wife, his young children. He begged to live. It was just another normal day at Auschwitz, until a man stepped out of the prisoner line, short, thin, small glasses perched on a weary face. He walked directly to the officer in charge. Hans saw everything up close, very close. The man spoke in slow, respectful German. "I would like to die in this man's place. He has a family. I have no one." The silence that followed was unlike any silence Hans had ever heard. It wasn't fear. It wasn't tension. It was reverence. The officer was confused. No one volunteered to die for another. Not there. Not in that place where humanity had been abolished by decree. "Who are you?" the officer asked. "I am a Catholic priest," the thin man replied. His name was Maximilian Kolbe, and he had just signed his own death warrant, out of love. Hans watched as they took Kolbe and the other 9 to the death block, cell 16, underground. No food, no water. There they would await death by starvation. It was protocol. Hans had seen it many times. Men descending into madness, screaming, struggling, losing their sanity before losing their lives. But from cell 16 came other sounds. Hymns, low at first, almost whispers, then clearer, louder. It was Kolbe singing hymns in Latin, and the other prisoners began to sing along. Hans went down to check. It was his job to maintain order, to ensure they died in silence. But when he looked through the bars, stop, take a deep breath, because what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about human nature. In cell 16, Kolbe stood, leaning against the wall, weak but straight. The other prisoners were around him, singing. These were not cries of despair. These were not lamentations. It was music. It was peace. Hans had never seen anything like it. Men starving to death, singing as if they were in a cathedral, as if they were happy. He returned the next day, and the day after, always listening to the hymns, always seeing Kolbe standing, leading the prayers. It was as if that thin man had found something that death couldn't touch. Day after day, the other prisoners died, one by one, but always singing, always at peace, until only Kolbe remained. After 2 weeks without food, without water, he was still alive, still singing. The officers were impatient. They wanted the cell free for new prisoners. They decided to speed up the process. They called Hans and another guard. The order was simple: administer a lethal injection. Hans entered cell 16 for the last time. Kolbe was sitting on the floor, thin as a ghost, but his eyes shone. When he saw Hans with the syringe, Kolbe smiled. and said, "Do not fear, my son." Son, a Jewish prisoner. Calling a Nazi soldier son, Hans felt something break inside his chest, a small crack, almost imperceptible. Kolbe extended his arm, voluntarily, as if it were an honor. And as Hans administered the injection, Kolbe began to sing, softly at first, then louder, a Latin hymn Hans didn't understand, but felt here, deep in his soul. Ave Maria, gratia plena. His voice was weak, but pure, crystal clear, as if it came from some place death couldn't reach. Hans was injecting poison into this man's veins, and he was singing for Hans, to comfort him, to forgive him. Hans felt his hands trembling. He felt the cold sweat on his forehead. He felt something shattering inside his chest. Kolbe looked directly into his eyes. No hatred, no fear, only compassion, as if it were Hans who was dying, as if it were Hans who needed comfort. The syringe emptied. The poison spread through his thin veins. But Kolbe continued singing, his voice growing weaker but purer, as if the nearness of death made the music more crystalline. Hans saw his pupils dilate. He saw his breathing slow. He saw life draining away, but his lips continued to move. Ave Maria, gratia plena. His eyes closing slowly, his body relaxing, but the music echoed through the concrete walls, until the last breath escaped like a musical note, until the last whisper of hope hung in the air, until the last whispered word, "Father, forgive," and then a silence that weighed tons, and then silence. Hans stood there, holding the empty syringe, staring at the body of the man who had died singing. His legs trembled, his stomach churned, his mind struggled to process the impossible. He had just murdered the purest man he had ever known. He had just killed someone who called him son. He had just silenced the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. And the worst was that Kolbe had died grateful to be able to give his life for another. Something had broken, something fundamental, irretrievably. The crack in his chest was now an abyss that swallowed everything Hans thought he knew about right and wrong. Hans left cell 16 walking like a ghost, heavy feet, an even heavier soul. The other guards spoke normally, laughed, made jokes, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't changed forever in those last few minutes. But for Hans, everything was different. The colors seemed faded, the sounds seemed distant. The air felt harder to breathe, because he had seen something that shouldn't have existed there. He had seen holiness amidst the evil. He had seen love where there should only have been hate. He had seen music in the quietest place on earth. That night, for the first time in months, he cried. He cried until there were no more tears. He cried until he understood that he had witnessed something impossible. He had seen a man transform his own death into music. He had seen someone use their last moments of life and to comfort their murderer. He had seen pure love in the darkest place on earth, and that changed everything. Hans began to question, first in whispers to himself, then in careful conversations with other soldiers. If that man could sing while dying, perhaps there was something greater than the Reich. If that man could forgive his executioner, perhaps there was something stronger than hate. If that man could choose love, even there, perhaps there was hope for everyone. The seed was planted, small, fragile, but unstoppable. Hans began to help prisoners, small acts of mercy that began as inexplicable impulses. In the first week, it was a piece of bread, broken in half, hidden in his palm, passed discreetly to a hungry child. In the second, a kind word whispered in German to a sick prisoner, "Everything will be all right." In the third, a human look, a silent acknowledgement that there was a person there, not just a number. Each gesture was a mortal risk. One single informant, and Hans would be executed for treason, but he couldn't stop. It was as if Kolbe's song had planted a compulsion within him, a physical need to spread small notes of humanity. Hans began to memorize faces, whispered names, fragmented stories. Jakob, who was a baker before the war, Sarah, who taught children, David, who played the violin in the streets of Krakow, people with lives, with dreams, with families waiting for them, people like Kolbe. With each act of secret kindness, Hans felt something rebuilding within his chest. The crack filling not with concrete, but with music. He risked his life with every gesture, but finally, he felt alive. Kolbe's song had created an echo that grew with every heartbeat, an echo that begged to be shared. Months later, Hans was transferred to another camp, then to the battlefront. The war continued its bloody course, but the music continued. Every night, before sleep, Hans remembered the fragile voice singing Ave Maria. Every morning upon waking, he felt the echo of that impossible peace, and he began to understand something profound about human nature, that there is a force, that even the greatest evil cannot destroy, that there is a light, that even the densest darkness cannot extinguish, that there is a song that even death cannot silence, because Maximilian Kolbe had discovered the final secret. He had discovered that love is stronger than fear, that faith is stronger than doubt, that music is stronger than silence, and that dying singing is the greatest victory possible. The war ended. Hans returned home, a bombed-out city, a destroyed family, a divided country, everything in ruins, except the music. Kolbe's music accompanied him in the reconstruction, in the search for forgiveness, in the attempt to find meaning after the horror. Hans sought the family of the man Kolbe saved. It took months to find the address, months gathering the courage to knock on that door. When he finally knocked, a middle-aged woman answered, graying hair, tired eyes, hands calloused from hard work. "I was there," Hans said simply. "I was there when your husband was saved." The woman was silent for long seconds, studying the face of that strange German man at her door. "Come in," she said finally. Hans told everything, every detail, every song, every final moment. He spoke of how Kolbe volunteered, how he sang for 2 weeks, how he died forgiving. The woman cried, Hans cried, the teenage children cried. But these were not just tears of sadness, they were tears of impossible gratitude. "My husband lived another 27 years because of that priest," the woman whispered. "He saw his children grow up. He saw his grandchildren born. He died peacefully, in his own bed." She held Hans's hands. Hands that had administered the lethal injection, hands that now trembled with remorse. "Thank you," she said, "for being there, for taking care of him in his last moments, for bringing this story to us." Hans collapsed into the arms of strangers who became instant family, because he had learned something that Kolbe had known all along, that there are connections deeper than blood, connections forged in sacrifice, connections that are born when someone chooses to die singing for love. Hans changed his name, he changed his life, he changed his heart. He became Hans Wolfgang, a man dedicated to sharing stories of redemption, and every night for 63 years before sleep, he sang softly, Ave Maria Gratia Plena, the same song he heard in that cell, the same music that broke his stone heart, the same melody that taught him that it's never too late to choose love. Because there are stories that haunt us to destroy us, and there are stories that haunt us to save us. Kolbe's story is of the second kind, a story that teaches us that the greatest power in the universe is not in weapons, it's not in strength, it's not in fear, it's in a fragile voice singing in the dark, it's in a thin man choosing to die for another, it's in a song that transforms murderers into sons, and that even today, echoes around the world. But the story doesn't end here, because 70 years later in a small German town, an elderly woman was dying, alone, abandoned, without family. Hans Wolfgang, now 93 years old, volunteered at the nursing home. He spent his days talking to people the world had forgotten. He entered her room on a rainy afternoon. The woman was conscious, but weak, very weak. "I'm afraid," she whispered. Hans sat beside the bed. He held her hand and asked, "May I sing for you?" She nodded, and Hans began to sing, softly, gently. Ave Maria, gratia plena, the same song Kolbe sang while dying, the same melody that saved him 70 years before. A woman's eyes filled with tears, not tears of sadness, but of peace. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Reminds me of home." "Yes," Hans smiled. "Reminds me of home too." And she died singing along, like Kolbe, as it should be. Hans left the room and noticed something extraordinary. The song had multiplied. For 7 decades, without realizing it, he had planted Kolbe's music in hundreds of hearts. Thousands of people who heard the story, who felt the impact, who changed. Dr. Martin Weber, a cardiovascular surgeon, heard the story during a medical conference in Munich. He began to softly hum hymns to patients before risky surgeries. Dozens of lives saved by hearts that stopped being afraid. Nurse Anna Richter heard Hans tell Kolbe's story on a difficult night at the hospital. She started holding the hands of terminally ill patients, whispering words of comfort, being a human presence in final moments. Professor Klaus Zimmermann, a former neo-Nazi who heard the story in a prison where Hans spoke to inmates. He left and became an educator, teaching children about tolerance, planting seeds of love where hatred once grew. 17-year-old Thomas considered suicide until he heard Hans speak at a Berlin school. He understood that there are more beautiful ways to die, living for others. Today he works with teenagers in crisis, doctors who treated patients with more humanity because they remembered Kolbe's compassion, nurses who chose kindness over efficiency because they heard about the sung sacrifice, children who forgave cruel parents because they understood the power of impossible forgiveness, wives who forgave alcoholic husbands because they saw that love can transform any heart, enemies who became friends because they discovered it's never too late to sing, all because of a song, all because of a man who chose to die singing. Hans finally understood the complete truth. Kolbe hadn't just saved one prisoner that day. He had saved all of humanity, one person at a time, one story at a time, one song at a time, because true love never dies alone. It always multiplies, always echoes, always finds a way to continue. And you who are listening to this story now, you are also part of this current, because there is something inside you that recognizes the truth when you hear it. There is something in your soul that knows that Kolbe was right, that in the end, the only thing that matters is the love we leave behind. The only song worth singing is the song that frees other hearts. The only legacy that endures is the hope we plant in dry land. Today, Hans Wolfgang is 98 years old, still alive, still singing. Every morning before leaving home, he stops in front of the mirror. He sees his wrinkled face. He sees his tired eyes. He sees his trembling hands, but he hears, clearly, Kolbe's voice. "Do not fear, my son." And he smiles, because he finally understands what Kolbe discovered in that cell. That dying singing isn't about death. It's about transforming your last note into someone else's first note. It's about using your fragile voice to awaken silenced voices. It's about planting a song that will grow long after you are gone. Hans looks in the mirror and sees not the Nazi soldier he was. He sees the son Kolbe saw. He sees the man the music created. He sees living proof that it's never too late to sing. And you? Can you hear it? very softly, deep down in your soul. A melody beginning to whisper your name. A song that recognizes your unique voice, that knows that only you can sing it the right way. A music that wants to use your life to heal a heart you don't even know yet. Maybe it's that co-worker who seems strong but cries in the bathroom. Maybe it's that elderly neighbor who never receives visitors. Maybe it's that difficult relative who hurt you but carries their own silent wounds. Maybe it's yourself. Who needs to forgive your own heart? A hymn that wants to use your presence to prove that love always wins, even when everything seems lost. Because Kolbe's story is not an old story from a distant concentration camp. It is a score of the present, written in notes of hope, composed in chords of possibility, written to be sung by you, by me, by all who choose to believe that there is something stronger than fear, something more lasting than hatred, something more powerful than death itself. In the end, we are all Hans Müller. We are all born with hearts trained not to feel, with eyes trained not to see humanity. We all live in our own prisons, our own internal Auschwitzes. We all need someone who chooses to die singing for us, and we all have the opportunity to be that someone for another person. The question is not whether you have a voice. The question is, what song will you choose to sing? Because Maximilian Kolbe proved something the whole world needed to know. He proved that love is higher than any wall. He proved that faith is stronger than any weapon. He proved that music is more powerful than any army. And he proved that dying singing is the most beautiful way to live forever. Cell 16 still exists in Auschwitz, preserved as a memorial. Millions of people visit every year. They stop in front of those bars, they read the story, and many begin to sing, softly at first, then louder. Ave Maria, gratia plena, the same song Kolbe sang, the same melody that saved Hans, the same love that even today transforms hearts of stone into hearts of flesh, because some songs never end, they just find new voices. Tonight, when you close your eyes to sleep, maybe you'll hear it. A soft melody, distant but unmistakable. It's Kolbe singing, it's Hans singing, it's all of humanity singing. The song that says, "Do not fear, my son." The music that whispers, "Love always wins." The hymn that declares, "It's never too late to choose hope." And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you will realize that your own voice is already singing along. Because that is the final truth about Kolbe's story. It doesn't end with his death. It doesn't end with Hans's transformation. It ends when you decide that you also want to die singing. Not literally, but symbolically, when you choose to use your life to plant music in dry hearts. When you decide that your last act will be of love. When you understand that the most beautiful song is the one that frees other voices. 73 years later, Kolbe's music still echoes across the world. In German nursing homes where volunteers sing to forgotten elders. In Brazilian favelas where single mothers find strength for another day. In American hospitals where doctors pause to hold patients' hands. In African orphanages where caregivers plant smiles on bruised faces. In classrooms where teachers choose patience over irritation. In offices where bosses choose understanding over demands. In homes where weary parents choose hugs over shouting. In broken hearts that choose forgiveness over bitterness. Wherever someone chooses love over hate, even when hate seems easier. Wherever someone forgives the unforgivable, even when revenge seems more just. Wherever someone sings hope, when it would be far easier to cry despair. Wherever someone reaches out a hand, when it would be safer to clench their fists. Kolbe's music resonates, it grows, it multiplies, and now the music has reached you. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you keep it to yourself, or will you let it grow? Will you hide it in silence, or will you transform it into song? Will you keep it as a beautiful memory, or will you use it as a transformative force? Because Kolbe didn't die singing to be admired. He died singing to be imitated. He planted a musical seed that only grows when it's shared. And today, 83 years later, the harvest continues. Every time someone chooses kindness over coldness, every time someone reaches out to lift someone who has fallen, every time someone sings hope amidst despair, the music multiplies, love spreads, Kolbe lives on, and you become part of the song, part of the story that is still being written, part of the melody that is still being sung. Because in the end, we discover that life isn't measured in years lived. It's measured in songs planted, in hearts touched, in lives transformed. And Maximilian Kolbe, with his frail voice singing in the dark, proved that a single song can change the world forever. The music continues, love endures, hope echoes, and somewhere, very softly, you can hear it. Ave Maria, gratia plena, the song that saved a soldier, the melody that frees prisoners, the hymn that transforms killers into sons, and that today wants to transform you too, into someone who dies singing, into someone who lives loving, into someone who leaves music. Where before there was only silence, the story ends, but the song never ends. It simply seeks a new voice, perhaps yours.